Colin, it's good to talk to you. Those of us who loved your first book, Young Skins, are fascinated by the fact that you have written a second book of stories with further masterpiece stories in it. And I suppose everyone who's on this is going to have some favorite story. And I want to start really with mine. And it's the last story, and it's called 10. And I wonder if you could just tell us what it's about without giving the plot away, and tell us how you came to write it.
Well, thanks, Colm. It's lovely to see you too. Lovely to see everyone from Castlebar and Kilchama. I'm only sorry I can't be there in person, but the 10, that story. What else did he give away? It's it's about a young guy who he's about 18 years old. He comes back to his hometown of Ballina, County Mayo, and he's spent the greater part of his adolescence unsuccessfully trying to make it as a pro footballer in England, a soccer player for Manchester United. So when the story picks up, he's working in his dad's car dealership. He's got an older brother who is working up in Dublin. He comes down for the weekend, and Danny, that's the protagonist, the footballer. He's also sort of just negotiating the weekend with his girlfriend Shona, who sort of stuck by him all those years. He was abroad in England trying to make it as a footballer. So it just kind of charts a weekend in the lives of those characters, that story.
Colin, I wonder if the short story form has any rules at all. And if it does have the rules, if the chances of breaking them are really what's exciting about the form. In other words, if you just look at James Joyce's Dubliners, you look at them, there's a number of different ways in which the story can be done, and how short it can be and how long it can be, how simple it can be in the way just almost nothing happens. And then in that final story, say, in the Dead, how much sort of textured life is integrated into the fabric of the story. And with this story, it isn't a novel. It isn't a novella, whatever a novella is. I mean, it remains in the status of story, but quite a lot happens, and quite a number of characters emerge, and quite a number of dramas are happening. So I suppose the first question is, do you? Let's just start at the very beginning of it. Do you start with a character? Do you start with an image, or do you start with a sentence?
I think I always thought of it starting with an image of a character, like a visual image almost, like a physical. Before I know anything about them, just I'll have a picture of them in my head, a very fuzzy one, very incomplete one. But and with that, it was very much the opening scene was the scene I wrote, which is Danny just sort of sitting in an office doing nothing. He's just sitting in fact, he wakes up after having fallen asleep. A fly has just nipped him in the head, or a mosquito, and a little bug, and so he wakes up, Midge, and he kind of snaps awake. And that was, I kind of knew he was an ex-footballer, or, that was his story, but I didn't really know much beyond that. I knew he worked at his father's dealership, but that was that image. And it took a long time. I spent a long time just on those opening sequences, which aren't very plot necessary, but just him sort of doing nothing in an office, waiting for time to trickle by. He checks the vents to make sure the aircon's working, and he's looking out the window and following the fly and all that sort of stuff. And then his dad comes in and they start talking, and it kind of picks up. But that's what I started with. That's what I tend to start with stories. But I mean, when I actually went back and looked at all this, I think literally either a character is introduced or they're named almost at the start of every story. Almost practically the first line is a character's name or a reference to them. So I can't claim anything other than the stories are very much character centered. They're character pieces,
So you start with that image, which, there's a bug, he's asleep, he's in a place, it's Friday afternoon, his father comes in. What's interesting first is that you're breaking a whole lot of rules in that the relationship between him and his father seems pretty good. In other words, the first thing you look at in an Irish story, when you have a father coming into the son, there's going to be some major attack one on the other. And also because people have read Young Skins, they realize, this surely something really violent and difficult is going to happen here, and dramatic. But actually, it's quite that opening really goes against the grain of what you've been doing before. It's quite gentle.
Yeah, I mean, it's I suppose I wanted to tell Danny's story, but it wasn't going to be one that had any kind of dramatic. It was a story I wanted to tell for years, and I knew a couple of guys from Mayo, who like went over, and people play a lot of sports in Mayo anyway, in Gaelic as well as soccer. But I knew guys who went over and came back, and a lot of them had this sort of like, they almost didn't mind. The pressure was so much, it's such a strange thing to do up your life when you're only a kid and go into this incredible high pressure environment. And so some of them came back with very philosophical about it. They really didn't mind that they were out of that madhouse, really. And so I did want to tell the story for years, and I really wanted to focus on this sort of like him kind of integrating, however difficult or not that is, but trying to gently reintegrate into his community. And I suppose I had the idea that I didn't want an antagonist. I didn't want him to have a bad relationship with his father or his girlfriend or the ex-coach or his brother. I just wanted to see what would happen. Could you tell a good story if everyone's kind of rooting for him, really?
Yeah,
everyone's kind of rooting for him. There's no major conflict.
It's fascinating how you build it. For example, he doesn't drink. It isn't as though he's come back and suddenly at a later age than everybody else, he has discovered the joys of alcohol and is really indulging himself. He's solid. And there's a moment where he's offered a joint. He sort of takes it, but it isn't his thing. So that he stands apart from others because in a way his time in Manchester it's not just that it's toughened him, it's given him a sense of, in a way, I suppose, purpose. That it isn't, and what's strange is it isn't as though he's lost that sense of purpose. It just doesn't have any focus for it, but he's still solid.
Yeah, it has given him a kind of identity in a series of habits and rituals, and he's kind of still, he abides by them. I imagine he's still, I didn't include a scene, but I imagine he still like goes training and goes working out and keep himself in shape, and he's not going to just start drinking and stuff like that. So, and that itself, marks him out as Shauna's sister Evie points out, that he doesn't drink. It's a unique enough trait, unfortunately, that it's worth a comment on. So just little things like that, I think, help to illustrate that he's a man out of place, as it were.
Were you tempted to keep the story tighter, in that it would just be a story about what actually happened to that family, which comes when he meets his brother from the train? And I think really skillfully, Colin, it's really beautifully done. I mean, I love the father-son scene because I think it's going somewhere, and it's not. It's just not going to do that for me. And then the father says to him, "Okay, so it's a no." And he said, "No, I didn't say no. Of course I'll do it. Of course I'll meet my brother off the train." Like, it's not, and that goes down. So that's not going to happen. And when the brother comes off the train, the brother's Ben, and the brother's in a wheelchair, but you don't make a big deal of that. He just comes off the train in a very skillful way, and he gets put into the car again in it, just as though it's just normal. You sort of normalize it. You don't make it into something that's sensationalized or sentimentalized or anything. It's just made normal. And then we want to know what happened. And so that there is. I mean, did you ever think, would that be the story of the result of that what it's like for that family?
I mean, I definitely wanted to be there in the background, and I mean, I don't know whether to my detriment or not. I enjoy introducing characters and extra characters. I think in the first draft he had a brother, but I literally don't think he showed up. And then I realized, well, why would I mention a brother if he's not going to appear and at least participate in the action? So, and the same kind of with Shauna's family, her sister, older sister, and her dad and stuff. So I just like collecting these characters and then seeing what you can do. And I mean, it ended up kind of being a long story because of that. But there's a few little games with the reader in that sense, that you're dangling the relationship with the father, who does have like a scar from a crash, and just how much of that information you dole out, and when you dole it out, I suppose, was like something I talked with people who read the story, and because I didn't want it to be a twist or sensationalize it or make it a kind of some sort of point of catharsis for the Danny character. I really wanted to I didn't want to take easy dramatic options, I suppose. I don't know whether that makes the most compelling story, but I think if you just keep that tension there, readers enjoy it.
No, it's absolutely compelling. And I mean, one of the things that happens is where the details, it isn't as though you say he had a scar. You just say he pulled up his shirt and he began to sort of scratch, and then you realize that from the wrist to the elbow, that there's a big scar, and then it becomes clear. But the first thing you notice, you don't know why he's scratching himself there, and so it's done as a sort of as a way, as a sort of live detail. I'm interested in the idea of, you don't know where the story is going. And what's strange is every time you bring us anywhere, for example, the sister, who's called Evie, I love how she's really, and there are people like that who are really competent in a Friday evening in a pub of finding a place with a table for four in the right part of the pub where she needs to be. And you realize that she doesn't need to meet her friends now. She's meeting her friends at 8. She just wants to get away from her kid, who she's left with her father. The father has made roast beef, which no one is going to eat because the mother is away somewhere. She never appears. But and then there's a baby who does something funny with a biro or with a pen. But in other words,
nursery rhyme book, yeah.
Sorry, nursery, or the nursery rhyme book that makes the music every time. But someone bites on a pen at some point, or
Evie anyway, does, and it looks like her mouth starts bleeding to Danny. So
yes. Just those tiny details, which actually are going to lead us nowhere. It's not as though that thing is going to that looks like blood is going to come up later. It's just another thing, like the roast beef, giving him a sliver of it to taste it, and the mother being away, like it just builds and builds with this accretion of credible detail. It isn't just credible detail, by the way. It is that you're in the pub when Evie is in the pub. You're in there with her. Somehow or other, in a few sentences, you've managed to create the pub. Similarly, there's a lovely moment where, the father, Evie's father and Shauna's father, was a teacher. And now he's retired. And the house is big, so they've opened a bed and breakfast. And our hero, who's Danny, just wonders, the idea of opening your house for people to traipse, I love traipse, to traipse in and out as a way of, maybe they need the money, but it is a bit odd as a way to make a living. And so all these things are being built. And all the time you're watching, in fact, that Danny is somehow in place and out of place. In other words, the Manchester thing is there. He's in a job with his father that it's not clear he's ever going to stay in. And there's a guy called Budgie, who's tremendous, who is one of those, every town or village has one. He just lives for sport and he wants everyone to be involved in sport. And he just really wants Danny back on the local soccer team. He wants him as a number 10. He just wants him in. And so, all the time, so what I'm wondering is, first of all, just give me a thing. How long did it take to write this?
Didn't actually take that long. I as I said, I've been thinking about that character. I've been wanting to write that story for years, So it was kind of it. I think it was the last story I wrote to put in the collection, and I wrote it in 2020. So I did write it over on and on. I had the kid. We had lockdown, so I had kids at home, so I was only kind of able to write in the evenings, for most of 2020. And so I did write it over. Yeah, it probably took 7 or 8 months on and off, but in just working on evenings. But I had the character of Danny pretty quickly, and I always had the opening scene in the dealership, and I knew he worked for his dad, and he used to be a footballer. So when I wrote the first draft, as I said, Ben, the brother, was absent, and it was, it really was, nothing happened to a detrimental degree in the first draft, but it was just a draft. And then I went back and I said, let's get Ben into it, and that sort of unlocked, that just created a new dynamic of, well, what if Shauna is going to have this, not quite a breakup, but talk with Danny, but Ben is there and her friend is there, and that complicated it. So I just found by putting in these details, by accreting these details, they just help me find a way through a story and help me generate momentum. I think even just the scene where he goes to the house that's the B&B and meets the parent, meets Shauna's father and Evie. Even if it was a shorter scene with less details, it would be totally unjustified. It just needed to breathe and have that accretion of credible little details, that make the characters alive. I guess that's always what I'm trying to do. It's what I like in books, whatever great themes or plot events are happening. I just live for those little details that make a character feel alive, and they're always kind of superfluous to a degree, but they're what bring it alive.
So do you add them, or are they there as you begin? In other words, that they could seem oddly superfluous. You have to judge them. It's a question of tact. I mean, they have to be right, but there's no proof they're right. I mean, it's not as though they're needed for the plot. They're needed for something else. They're needed for the reader's engagement.
And
So
there's ones that are wrong as well. Like in a draft, I had another guy who worked in the dealership who was kind of a comical character, but he wasn't necessary. You know, it was just that Danny has this.
so at what stage does he fall away?
He fell away in kind of the second draft. Yeah, and he was there, and I knew I needed someone else in with the father and Danny, and I guess, and it ended up being Ben the brother. But for a while, it was this other guy who just, you know, who worked in the town and worked in the dealership. But it just, and it's a question of pacing too. It made that open scene too long and cumbersome. Whereas with Ben is the reason Danny has to go somewhere. Now he's got a time limit. He's got to go to Sean's house. These are very elementary things, but they do, you know, get the story on a track. And so then he has a time limit. He's got to pick up Ben. So it just made the whole thing, you know.
When you're drafting, do you do a whole new draft again, or do you sort of fill in and take out from a sort of master draft?
Oh yeah, well I always keep safety documents backed up, and but then I will, yeah, I'll start from the start with a new draft and see how it goes, you know.
Yeah. Tell me something. You know, when I'm writing about Enniscorthy, I call it Enniscorthy, and if it's the Market Square, it's the Market Square, and then there's Rafter Street, and then there's Wafer Street, and there's Main Street, and then there's Slaney Street.
Yeah.
And like, I'm absolutely clear where it is, and anyone going to the town will say, well, that's where they went down. And if they go down Slaney Street, you know, they hit you know, the bottom of Slaney Street. And if they're going to Bunclody, it's that way, and if they're going to Wexford, it's the other way. So what's your view on this business of topography and naming places and being very precise about locality?
Yeah, I mean, it felt right to just use the real, because in Youngskins, obviously, I had the conceit of the town, this fictional town, Glanbay, which doesn't exist in Mayo and is a composite of towns I knew. But in all the stories in Homesickness, I just kind of used the real names, I suppose. But I'm not very diligent about geography particularly. I'm just bad at it anyway. I'm bad at giving directions. I'm bad at receiving directions. I'm bad at memorizing directions and names of places and names of people. So it's a little bit more, I always, you know, I get out of this by going, it's a little bit more dream. It's a bit more like how I have a geography in my head, but it's one from memory of the house I based this B&B on, the car dealership, the football pitch. But you know, it wasn't that, I mean, also I was literally stuck in Toronto and couldn't go back to check. But, you know, it's pretty loose, but you know, just what serves the story. It is more on these physical places are always more. They're based on my memory, the dream geography of my memory of places, rather than you know, I'm not one of those people who get the town plans and stick diligently to them. Maybe I should, but you know.
One of the things that's great about the story is that there are a few linking passages where you actually become almost lyrical. It's wonderful to watch you moving into that space where you describe the landscape. For example, they're sort of driving out into the countryside, and the road to Lacan ran right along the coastline. For the majority of the drive, you couldn't see the Atlantic, but you could feel it. The way the horizon just dropped clean off into the sky, gulls swirling like paper plates in the updrafts out over the low invisible sea. I thought that was pretty good. You know, in other words, it wasn't, it was so precise as a thing that it has to have a sort of, I suppose I'm asking, what sort of memory brings that to you?
Well, that is my memory of landscape. It's very associative, and it's you know, it's images. And it's just those sort of glimpses of things, and it's nothing unique. It's things you see a million times a day, but you know, over the course of your life. But you haven't seen them in a while, they stick with you and they begin to glow in your memory. You know, so it seemed very important to have it in there.
And then there's a wonderful passage later on. Colm, I'm not going to read out your whole book to you. I promise you're not going to do this. But there's a wonderful paragraph that begins, in the distance above Nephin Mountains, the stars were appearing. Now, stars are always dangerous in a story. If you've got to put stars in, you got to do something really careful. You know, he looked up, he saw the stars. You know, they were twinkling. Give us a break. So listen to this. In the distance above Nephin Mountains, the stars were appearing in the highest, darkest reaches of the sky. Danny wondered if he was still a little high. I mean, he's taken a few puffs of a joint, because the stars looked like mistakes. glimmering little misimpressions you assumed would not be there if you looked again, but they were. And again, the question is, how many drafts did that? I mean, in other words, it's a pretty good piece of star work, you know. I mean, it's
Yeah,
if you could put
he was
stars,
high, so I was like, I can get away. Danny wouldn't notice the stars otherwise, but he's high for the first time in his life, so he's going to have a experience of the sublime, I suppose. So yeah, I felt that sort of, but I was careful about that. You're absolutely right. Stars, sea, sky, it's all dangerous territory. So you got to be trying to do something different with it, and I, just in the end, it goes to character. I think that's what I've learned over the last few years. You can come up with a nice metaphor or a nice piece of descriptive language, but it has to be anchored in character. So to me, anyway, in that moment, this lyrical little interlude is allowed given Danny's exact circumstances. He's possibly been dumped. He's high. He's kind of just accepting how adrift he is in his life, and he's just, so he has his little moment looking up, and then it's gone.
Yeah, he's possibly been dumped by his girlfriend, and because we know him at this point, we realize what a blow this is going to be, because that's another of your characters. It happens also in Young Skins, the whole idea of someone leaving to go to college and someone staying at home being left behind, and the whole difference already apparent from the first weekend of that experience. And here it's coming again. So there's what are you going to do with Danny? When he's driving back in with his brother, and she's really has dumped him, actually, but it's going to be, it's an open question for a while. And what does he do? And he does something really wonderful. God, I don't know how you thought of it. He goes in to get gas. He goes in to get petrol, and then Danny got himself a blueberry ice pop. He goes straight into childhood comfort food, a blueberry ice pop. There was an ice cream freezer to the next door, and he sat sideways in the driver's seat of the car with the door open, his feet on the forecourt concrete as he sucked away on the pop. And his brother says to him, "You big baby," Ben says over the shoulder. He says, "I am." And then it's lovely. A chunk of the ice pop, this is later, it slid off the stick, and Danny held it in his mouth, then get burned against the inside of his cheek before he swallowed it. But it's a wonderful moment. Like all the things he could do. He could curse. He could drive too fast. He could bang the driver wheel. No, he goes and gets what's it called again? It's a blueberry ice pop. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good one, comfort food.
Yeah, I mean, that was he was just the character I was interested in writing, which is a guy who, keeps it together, doesn't explode. Men are very hysterical. They do explode at the drop of a hat. So, but he's someone who's quite composed, and even though he's going through a miserable time, but he's trying to simulate keeping it together, and that's his whole thing. So, I mean, the blueberry ice pop was just, for him that would be an indulgence as well. He had to count every calorie over in the football academy. So even that is a little, and it seemed apt that it's a kind of quite a childish, he's been frozen in time almost as well, as a person. So.
Have you noticed how little there is in Irish writing in general about actual sport, considering how much sport is played in the country and how much space it takes up in the public imagination? That there's hardly anything about GAA, but there's certainly very little about local soccer. And so that bringing a character onto the soccer field and having play is actually quite a moment. I mean, it's not something that's happened much before in the long tradition, even of the Irish short story.
I suppose not, but yeah, I had to throw it out there. But I mean, again, it just it was nice. I didn't have, when I started the story, I had the character, but of course I didn't know where it was going to go. So I mean, once I kind of realized I would reintroduce the Budgie character, Coach, who would be hunting him down to get him back to play, fanatically. I kind of thought, well, that's where it's going to go. We're going to have a little moment on the pitch, and I mean, just and trying to do that and have it be like, because it's just there's a little bit of a football match played, and it's just for him. I mean, he's way too good to play in it. It's like it's just, it's a local kickabout, but I didn't want to. I mean, I wanted moment to carry some sort of weight and to not be a moment of cheap fun or anything like that. So
yeah.
carry some sort of dramatic.
Was it ever tempting to have his? I mean, he goes and plays for the locals, and was it ever tempting to have that being a disaster, like some big fella from out the country would come and kick him, or that he wouldn't score the goal? Like I love the fact that you give in to a sort of moment of pure local triumph, and he can kiss his girl.
Yeah.
Everyone watching. It's just really beautiful. It's really hard thing to do, though, isn't it? Because you feel constantly that the short story must be filled with defeat, disappointment. Sort of like, if there's going to be a match, if there's going to be a girl, she's going to dump the guy. It's going to be a soccer match, someone's going to actually, not score.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose you're already. I mean, I get away. Maybe if I get away with that story, it's because it's already, the whole thing is happening inside the. It's already been engulfed in the shadow of a lifelong defeat for Dan, which is he's already, his dream or whatever has ended. So you kind of, once you're inside that already, you don't have to. You I think you buy the chance to have those moments of light, moments of happiness, and moments of positivity, really, and just the shadow is still there over it all. I think of his greater defeat or failure, what you call it.
Anyway, congratulations on the story. I mean, it's really impressive. I mean, I've read it a number of times, and technically it's extraordinary. It's really brave, and it does all sorts of things. I love how Ben has shaved his head and the reason why, and he doesn't tell the brother. There's so many details in it I love. I want to ask you about a story about the drone, because it's your first story, as far as I'm aware, that's set in Toronto. And since it's where you're living, I just wonder about again, the locations, the parks, he's walking the dogs. There's a whole sense of the geography of Toronto. There's a sense of cold. I just wonder if you could talk to us about the consciously or unconsciously realizing that you have a new territory. There's a new topography available to you.
I took some tentative steps into Toronto. It felt like the pandemic gave me permission to write about it. And obviously the pandemic features in that story. And that somehow it felt okay, because we'd all entered the pandemic zone, the purgatory of the pandemic. So I felt like my, whatever you would call it, my sort of trepidation about writing about Toronto, because I just feel like what am I going to be able to say about it, was nullified by this event. And so setting a story in Toronto in the pandemic, just I thought it would be interesting to do, and thought it might pay off. So I mean, geography and stuff is just, when the lockdowns were happening, I was going out running a lot late at night, and just out of like whatever, just to, boredom and anxiety and whatever else. And I was kind of doing a route, we were living downtown at the moment, so there's a park, Grange Park, which is the park in it. Maybe I call it something else, but anyway, it's right downtown near the Modern Art Museum, and then a couple of miles up the road is north of the university is a very fancy estate, which is where I put the character Caber's house. And it's beautiful looking. It's up on a hill, it's elevated. It's just all really modern, super expensive, homes. And I was just running up and around there at night in the dark. And that story just came out of that experience, I suppose. On the snow, I realized, I think, and then when I point out in the review, I think there's stories in Mayo with snow, and sure, it's only snowed in Mayo once in the last 25 years or something. But that was definitely a, metaphorical drift from living in Toronto. I now think there's been more snow in Mayo than there actually has.
Yeah, it's lovely letting some of the Canadian snow move across.
It's okay, it's not so bad. Yeah, but definitely there's more. I've depicted more than there actually has been.
Can I ask you about another story, the Silver Coast? There are moments in stories which depend on something we don't understand. As an image comes that cannot be cleared up, and that remains all the more powerful because somebody saw something and didn't understand what it was, and you place it at the very center of the story. I think in number 10, there are a number of times where we think this is happening. For example, when they go out to look at the turbine being made, being the blade being put on, you think this is going to be a big moment somehow, that the turbine is going to carry a lot of weight. I mean, symbolic weight in the story, but oddly enough, it sort of doesn't. You just let it down. It's just another thing that happens in the story, another locus, another place characters can go, but you don't give it a big presence. But in The Silver Coast, there's a wonderful moment at the center of the story. I wonder if you could just tell us about it, where someone remembers that the dead woman, Lydia Healy, did something once that really is mysterious and isn't explained. And it has to be very delicately done because it has to remain really important as well as not explained.
Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of a risk to do that, and it's an open question whether it pays off, whatever. But it had to be just a moment. Yeah, the main character's mother saw this woman Lydia years ago at a wedding, and she just kind of, she was in the foyer or whatever, and the hotel, and it was there was no one behind the counter, so this woman Lydia just ducked to the counter and began rifling through whatever was behind there, and the woman who observed this sort of didn't know what was happening and just walked by, and then it was never mentioned again. So that was her abiding memory of this woman who died in his funeral, the story concerns. And yeah, I mean, it was, it's one of those moments where you're like, where am I going to do? What am I going to do with this? Where am I going to take it? The story just seemed to be going in that direction. It was, it's the most sort of, I don't know what the word would be, story, like slight or elusive or something story in the collection, I think. And it just, I knew it wouldn't hinge on much to land. And so it just felt out to have it be that moment and have it not be something so that would nag the reader too much, because you have to try and keep the reader in mind. So you want to present what is a kind of little mystery to a character that doesn't knock the story off course for the reader by being too much. So that's the only thing I was keeping in mind when I was trying to come up with that exact scenario,
Yeah. There's another story I want to ask you about. And again, these are technical questions because I'm interested in them. There's a story called The Ways, and it's wide open in this story for you to do flashback, because it's a story in which there's a palpable absence, which is that both of the parents have died, leaving these three children, one of whom is child, the other of whom was an adolescent, and the other of whom was a bit older. But the three of them are really left. And what we don't get in the story, what you really, you don't give in to the temptation of offering us an image of them before all this death happened, that you bring it into, it's emphatically in the present tense.
I think that's something I do with all the stories, and I often, I know what the backstory is with characters, but I do try and keep as much of it out, just to see how much of it you can keep in the moment, keep in the present, and see if you can, imply all that stuff, capture something of that without having to go into it. And so it definitely, it's a method I do in The Ways, most notably, but it happens with whoever's there come on through, and it's even the 10. There's no sort of elaborate, like I've no scene of Danny as over in England or in the academy or any kind of, it all just happens. The stories always just happen in the wake of these things, and that's what I'm interested in writing about. I guess I'm just attracted to something big has happened, but writing in the wake of it, in the present that comes after it all.
Yeah, I wonder if some of it has the results of a lot of writing courses and creative writing teaching is the idea that somehow everything has to be explained, and that backstory, give us backstory. And backstory, is the pluperfect. 5 years earlier, she had been where her parents had been. You go, had been is the most unsayable, unwritable. You go, could get every had been out of your story, because had been, whatever way English was made, had been is the worst. It's the ugliest two words. He had been several years in England. Oh, he had been, and you go, stop, had been. And the great thing about The Ways is that the had been is just left to your imagination. You realize this must have it. Oh, there's a lovely moment in it where Nick, who's the older brother, and he's working in a sort of restaurant, and he's become responsible. But there is a mention that before all these tragedy, he was really quite wild, but now he's become a much more sort of a solid fellow. he's had to change, but you don't get an image. You don't give us an image of, oh, among the things he had done when he had the, you know, that you keep it in the dramatic moment. I think it makes the story much more dramatic that you don't do all that. And I think it's very tactful and brilliant of you not to do that.
Well, thank you. It's just trying to be competent is all I'm ever trying to be, but with these things. But I definitely, I maybe it is just wanting to avoid the packed-in grammatical quicksand.
I mean, I think in this story, The Ways, you get a sense through images in the present tense, and sometimes very small ones, of just how damaged Jerry is, just how shocked he is, and how all his behavior really can be it really is a result of grief, and that this is a house of grief, and that his sister Pell seems tremendously intelligent and good, but she's at home in bed all the time because she doesn't want to go to school anymore because all of this, and you get a sense of encroaching damp of them having no food. Even if they had food, they don't eat the food. And then you get a brilliant sense of Jerry with his PlayStation. Did you research? I read it and thought, God, I wish I thought of PlayStation. I mean, did you research PlayStation? It is PlayStation, is it?
Is it an Xbox or PlayStation? I think it might be an Xbox.
Anyway, it's one of those things, yeah.
For the phrase Xbox to PlayStation, but yeah, it's the same thing. Video game consoles, and I mean, I made up the game, but it is based on you know, there's video games that are more or less the equivalent of that. There's one, Red Dead Redemption 2 is like one set in the old West, the American frontier West, and you can go off and, you know, hunt buffalo and shoot cowboys and stuff. And so the game in it is kind of roughly equivalent to that. But I just, you know, I invented one with a storyline to fit the story. So I mean, again, it just, you know, it was just trying to find something that he would be, just to get a sense of him, but just through, without the, you know, once you start using flashbacks as well, Colin, I think, and once you start doing that, it becomes a, you know, you have to justify why you stop using it, you know, or whatever. So I just try to avoid all that. But can you find something in the present dynamic of a character that will go towards showing in this case, their grief, their inertia. And so those, the video games are pretty good one, because the video games, like, I played video games when I was younger and stuff, and they're a great waste of time, you know, which like a lot of things.
I mean, what's skillful and interesting about the story as well is that, you know, the images have to be really centered around images of loss and grief, and each of them wounded and shocked by this. But if you only do that, you lose the story too. So there's a lovely moment, for example, there's a Chinese guy working with Nick, and the Chinese guy, I think he's called Sean by everybody because they find his name unpronounceable, even though his name is perfectly simple Chinese name. And there's a lovely moment where Nick just thinks, well, really, these guys should learn the guy's proper Chinese name. It isn't that hard. And you just see him in another moment where the grief isn't what's bothering him most, where other small things come into play. And even when Pell is on the bus and meets the other two guys on the bus, there are moments where everyone moves outside what they're meant to be doing in the story to do one other thing, which is so the story has a sort of, I suppose it makes the shock it makes the idea of grief all the more present, because it's not always present.
Yeah,
that's important, isn't it?
The medium they're moving in, but they're doing other things, you know, and that's, I don't know, that just makes sense to me, that's how people end up having to cope with these things, you know.
Colin, thanks very much for doing this, and thank you very much for everyone in Mayo for being involved, and we'll talk to you all again soon.